the function of consuming high-end goods, and so this is things like Louis Vuitton handbags and Mercedes-Benz sedans and that sort of thing, is basically to be seen consuming. Or again, to signal one's high status. And the kind of amusing point that that Veblen, I think, touches on, that Merton really kind of drives home, is that there's nothing, so where Merton talks about the manifest function of a car is to get you from point A to point B, reliably, reasonably fast, whatever. And to be honest, a Toyota is going to do that a lot more reliably than a Mercedes or a Bentley, and in fact, maybe just as, if not more, comfortable than those high-end luxury automobiles. Again, certainly much more reliable than them. But so what they actually do, is equivalent. But again, the point of driving those high-end automobiles, or the point of using a really expensive handbag as opposed to a handbag that you buy at Marshall's or something like that, is to be seen having those things, to signal to people like, I have the money, I have the cultural power to do this. That's kind of cut one. Cut two at this, and really kind of more towards mainstream sociology, was Max Weber, who of course we've encountered several times already here. And Weber's distinction here was lifestyle, which he called status, versus social class. Social class is just about money in Weber's understanding, but status, this other thing, is really about your lifestyle, and that, in that sense, it's about consumption. And he takes it to really kind of interesting places. I mean, it's all for him, a way of looking at the way that society is divided up into groups. Some of which, and he's very kind of methodical about this, saying, these groups may or may not have power over each other. They may or may not have more money than each other, but saying that really what you consume distinguishes you from other people in the society. So, and goes into some situations where it's even there are prohibitions regarding who can consume what, so it's like he likes to talk about caste society in India because it's so, or it was so rigid, and had so many kind of rules and practices associated with these distinctions between people of higher and lower statuses with one another. But he would point out things like, certain members of certain castes are allowed to worship in certain temples, they're allowed to eat certain foods, they're allowed to wear certain kinds of articles of clothing that members of lower castes aren't. And he points out that, of course, something like this is at work in Western societies as well. Certainly not with the rigidity, or maybe the explicit rules that we see in Indian society. But all the same, it's again something like a poor person can't consume, the working classes, which does actually equate more or less to a status in our society. They can't consume, Louis Vuitton handbags or Brooks Brothers suits or those kinds of things. And there's certainly the suggestion there that people who can consume those things, look down upon those who can't afford it, and if not, explicitly rub it in their noses, use it as something to distinguish themselves, to sort of, maybe make them a bit more secure in their senses of superiority, and so on. And again, as always, by the way, if this isn't making sense, or if you want to chime in with a question, please, I'll hear the ding. I can't see you right now while I'm writing on the whiteboard, but I'll hear the ding. And then this is like the Veblen's late 19th century, Weber's early 20th century. In the 70s and 80s, Pierre Bourdieu, who was a French sociologist, wrote a number of articles kind of along these lines before writing his book Distinction, which I think comes out in France in '79 and comes out in America in '84. And this is the same stuff, or is related to that material we were talking about in Ferguson, where he's arguing that people live in fields. And we can especially take sort of the field of culture or consumption here. But he did it with, I wish I had the original sort of illustration of this. It was a transparency sheet of like certain things that he would overlay over other things. Sorry, that was a yawn. Excuse me. He did it by saying like in particular the occupational structure of France aligns very closely closely but imperfectly with the consumption patterns of French people, and did this based on surveys from the 60s and 70s. And his argument is, well, so just to kind of think about what those sort of positive aspects of culture, or the more valued aspects of culture, or the aspects of culture that are more associated with the upper classes, and this is a bit of an oversimplification of him perforce, but this is things like eating fish. I guess fish isn't even that great an example. Eating what the heck is that stuff? Foie. I think I spelled that wrong. I think there's no S. Foie gras. which is this expensive duck liver pate or caviar, right? These are shall we say persnickety kind of things that only the well-to-do tend to eat, as opposed to eating roasts or sausages. And going to the theater, as opposed to going to the theater, as opposed to watching a lot of TV. Or listening to pop music, as opposed to opera. And he did this with just with a ton of different cultural practices, consumption habits, but well, and the point, and a couple of points. If you'll recall, we've kind of we talked about this issue of the habitus a few different times, and most specifically with respect to Ferguson's work on the culinary field. But what he's saying is that this is a really sort of, I guess, almost insidious aspect of the class structure that makes it very difficult for people in the lower echelons to rise to higher levels in society because of your habitus, because being socialized at the higher end of things gives you what we would refer to as savoir-faire. Which means just strictly to know how to do, or just know how. People who are raised by rich people, eating foie gras and caviar and going to the theater, having stacks of Deutsche Grammophon LPs being listened to on a Macintosh hi-fi system in your home, right? That teaches you how to be a member of the upper class. It's not just job skills or whatever. It is these so-called soft skills of cultural consumption patterns that really establish these distinctions. And he goes to great lengths to kind of say, the people who love this stuff say, oh, it's natural to love this, and only better quality people can really understand the opera, when in fact, of course, it's taught, right? It's taught to these people throughout their lives. That's why they think it's natural. It's not at all natural. It's a very socially constructed thing. But this is, this hence the title distinction, right? Because the distinction between cultural consumption patterns and a lot of other practices, is what distinguishes in part the upper classes from the lower classes, and helps them to maintain a sense of superiority, helps them to exclude others from obtaining the kind of goods that they obtain. And one final point, and I realize I kind of did this a little bit backwards in terms of the articles over the next couple of days. So Jacob has a rather complicated refinement of this theory, but then Mary will kind of look at a somewhat more orthodox American rendering. So Bourdieu is in France, obviously. In the U.S., and it's interesting. Even Weber, going back 120 years or so, said fairly similar things. He's like, the Americans are a little bit different about how they do lifestyle. They tend to use lifestyle distinctions less strictly than the Europeans. And so when people in the U.S. Started to apply, or they basically taking Bourdieu's hypothesis and applying it to Americans, often with survey data, often from the GSS, looking at Americans' consumption patterns. Excuse me. So these are guys like Pete Peterson, Paul DiMaggio. Their finding is that the upper class, rather than just picking and choosing certain things as being highbrow and culturally important as a sign of their distinction from the working classes, the upper class in America are referred to as omnivores. And we'll see Goldberg and company do a pretty good job problematizing this notion in today's reading. But the idea with omnivores is that they consume all or most genres. I say most because there's some interesting articles like Bethany Bryson's article about music consumption that found that upper class people listen to all kinds of music except heavy metal. The title of the article is like everything but, or anything but heavy metal. And the related finding, for the lower class, for the lower class is that the lower class tends to be univores. They prefer one kind of, one genre in whatever it is that we're looking at. Again, music has been sort of the go-to, but things like food, things like film, things like books as well. And you may know people like this with I'm sure you know people like this, right? People who listen to nothing but hip hop, right? Or people who listen to nothing but country music, right? That is, in the estimation of this literature, and when they do the sort of the correlations with class and occupations, they find, those folks who listen to just one genre or consume just one kind of food, or read, you probably know people who read just mystery novels or just romance books, right? Those people tend to be members of the working or the lower class, and people who consume across different genres tend to be more in the upper class. So the requirement, it's not as snobby, I guess is a way to put it. It's not as snobby as the French tended to be. Not just saying this one thing is the best and we're not going to consume any of the rest of it, but uh, but it is rather about a sort of a demand for familiarity, which is at the same time a demand for a sort of a kind of leisure time, a demand for having the resources, to seek out different kinds of music or different kinds of books, to have the education to be able to understand or appreciate different genres of things. But ultimately, in the conclusion of this literature, it is a kind of distinction, nonetheless, and ultimately not all that different from what Bourdieu was finding with the French. Okay, so that's rather a lot of background, but really, I think important to know that this is this kind of big, vibrant enough literature that sets the backdrop for the next couple of readings here. So going over here, and yeah. So unless there are questions, I'm going to turn it over to Jake, and we're going to talk about boundary spanners, variety, and atypicality in consumption.
All right, thank you. Here. I think you're presenting. Okay, there we go. All right. Can you see that fine? Okay. All right. So, what does it mean to span cultural boundaries? And, um, well, starting off, this piece is by Goldberg, and Hannon, and I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Cobvox? I'm
I,
not
I
quite
would
sure.
either say Kovac or Kovacs, depending on.
Kovacs?
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Um, and there's some key ideologies to this. Um, First thing probably to know is you might think of spanning boundaries as like a big word, but if you put it in layman's terms, it's just basically connecting barriers, or learning how to connect everything together, like different cultures and stuff like that. And there's two lines of research that they outline. One is cultural omnivores analyze choice by heterogeneous audiences, and the second is in markets. These omnivores analyze homogeneous audiences to objects that confirm categorical codes or norms. Um, this sort of develops a model for these audiences, evaluating objects that allow consideration for these orientations on the two dimensions of cultural preference. And these two dimensions are variety and atypicality. And I'll go into further detail about that in the next couple slides. Um, the audiences um, that value variety and atypicality are resistant to these objects that span these sort of cultural boundaries. Um, and we see these tested in films and restaurants in the the study. And then going onto the intro, um, the there's sort of categorical boundaries that organize social life. Um, so, in other words, there's, I guess, a spectrum, sort of, and I'll go into the diagrams too in a minute. Um, and then there's symbolic distractions, and that's between different practices and behaviors um, that maintain social order by institutionalizing different differences between people um, who enact them. Um, Sociologists tend to pay a lot of attention to boundary spanning, especially in traverse boundaries. Um, Cultural omnivores. Oh, here's a good definition. It's basically a taste for a broad variety of cultural products and practices. And it's basically, here in quotations, I'm trying to say they're more open-minded than your typical person, because they're essentially have broader cultural tastes. Um, and continuing on with the intro and getting into more about the variety and atypicality, um, cultural omnivores resist cultural scripts, um, and the consideration can be resolved by the two prisms, variety and atypicality. Variety is the tendency to appreciate multiple types of cultural practice, so more well rounded, more knowledgeable about different cultural practices. And then atypicality is um, where it's kind of like the polar opposite of variety, and they defy conventional categorical boundaries, um, and these all connect with greater omnivorous and post. Uh, so this is like an example. I forgot where I was going with this, but um, I think I was trying to connect this to the U.S., but um, I lost where that was going. Um, Going on to slide 5, um, with theoretical fusion, um, the collective imagination sort of as- associates genres of different music with different social identities, and the sense that traverses symbolic social boundaries. Um, and then the two dimensions um, in which cultural consumption has social meaning, and that is variety, that relates to the enactment of multiple identity, social identities, and then of course, the atypicality, non-compliance of cultural codes. Um, then there's an okay, so imagine that there is a system of classification um, that's organized by social domain, and example would be a division of dining with different cuisines, and this is shown in the next slide with the diagram. Here, I can actually show you this. Um, as you can see, Mexican, um, and this kind of shows there's sort of four, I don't know how you'd put this, four different types of people. Um, one's a polypurist, one's a polymixer, one's a monopurist, and one's a monomixer. And this can definitely be related to what Professor Dempsey was talking about with the we were just talking about in the notes with the whole um, the box with the different sides to it. This definitely goes off of the diagram, um, and the going back to the other diagram, as you can see, if we go back here, polypurists enact multiple identities, and they're against cultural codes. Monomixers are the mirror image, and they prefer particular uh, genre fusion and are outside of cultural and genre boundaries. And as you can see, the monomixer is outside of the boundary. Um, I hope I explained that good enough. Um, and then who who rejects these um, barrier connecting objects? That would be polypurists, and they embody this sort of resolution, and they prefer more typical objects. And cultural innovation goes in with this, as the article points out, and the definition of cultural innovation is a quality that emerges from actions that combine elements of otherwise disconnected cultural codes. And when when I say codes, I'm meaning the set of images and symbols that associate with um, a broad variety of stereotypes in our minds. Um, how does atypicality relate to an orientation towards variety? Um, work in the omnivore studies tends to show a taste for variety as expression of cultural open-mindedness. Um, so once again, very very open-minded individuals. Um, and then the appreciation for diversity can also function as identity claim, and that's sort of defined as an enactment of social boundary. And then the results for the study um, was there were two hypotheses, and these both regard in regards to the relationship between taste profession profiles and the appeal of atypical boundary spanning in films and restaurants. Um, and the hypotheses concern the interactions of object atypicality with taste profiles and their effects on latent appeal. And the reviewers with rich taste for atypicality were more likely to appreciate atypical offerings than those um, who prefer more variety. And then going to the effects of an object's atypicality. Um, so I wanted to mention to add a little bit of some statistics in here, and kind of like talk about the, for example, the p-value is less than 0.001, which is the alpha, um, and kind of mentioning standard errors. And I was just trying to connect this with my social statistics class. And I guess I can go on to discussion questions. How can we interconnect social class and boundary spanning? What do each class standing enact in regards to representativeness of the polypurist, monopurist, polymixer, or monomixer? And what do you guys think?
Maybe we need to go back for a second before we can really uh, uh, get that. If you can maybe go back to the previous slide about the statistics on it.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean the thing. It's a little bit their reporting of the statistics is a little, they take a really complicated thing and they try to make it as straightforward as possible here. Um, and what and audiences member positions in the four quadrants on the appeal of films and restaurants. I'm not actually quite sure what that particular table is telling us. But um oh, okay. So
Yeah, I think it's in here if I am correct. Somewhere.
yeah, it's from page 25.
Oh, okay.
Um so and it's a pretty difficult statistic to interpret. I think maybe um and we all should have access to the paper if folks want to pull it up on uh, on Moodle or whatever. If you go back to table two, in a sense, table two is a validation of their
These tables?
table two in the paper is on page 20.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but this is the one that says, oh yeah, you can get it right there. Yeah, that's cool. So if you go up a little bit to page 22 there. Yeah. So in a sense, that's validating this hypothesis that that omnivore doesn't mean what those guys like DiMaggio and Peterson have thought that it means, right? So omnivore, in a sense, we've kind of assumed it means, you like all kinds of genres, you like all kinds of art. It doesn't matter if it's more or less typical in their sense. And what they're finding is that we do in fact have people. So we could so mono. When you look at mono, that essentially is what we used to call or are used to calling univores, right? They like one genre. So like mono whatever with films are like people who only watch westerns or only watch rom-coms or something like that. And then poly would be you watch a lot of different genres. But then the purist versus mixer thing is about typicality. So it's about, in the way that they're conceiving it, it's about avoiding hybrids, right? So with restaurants like that chart that you had, like if you have a Cambodian restaurant that like puts, I don't even know what like if you can get like a pho taco or something like that. So if you're like mixing Cambodian food with Mexican food with Chinese food, like that's a mix. If you're a mono mixer, you only like Asian food, but you're okay with Asian food that's mixed with other stuff, right? If you're a mono purist, you only like pure, like just Cambodian food, right? If you're a poly mixer, you like you like the weird stuff and you like the straight up orthodox stuff. The big argument though is that there are people who are poly purists, right? Who only want to, they'll sample across genres, but they only want the really typical ones. So you don't want a Western that's also a rom-com, or you don't want the Cambodian restaurant that serves tacos as well. You'll happily go to a taco restaurant. Like an Orthodox Mexican restaurant. You'll happily go to like a normal Cambodian restaurant or Chinese restaurant, but you don't want these weird hybrids. Now, if you go back to your slideshow there and that table 5 down below, right? Yeah. And and this is a little bit more complicated, right? But this is a little weird. Right? So the object atypicality. Oh, okay. So times mono mixers, right? This is essentially where they're trying to prove their point. So they've found these groups of people with different tastes, and now they're really trying to check whether there is that, like you said, the statistical association there between the object atypicality and the kind of cultural consumer that you are, right? So now the mono mixers are happy, right? So this is like it's taking their ratings, and really, I would say it's this is a real the math here, right? The statistics are really complicated, but at the same time, like really interesting. You can get pretty geeked out about how they do this because they took, and it makes me sad. So this is kind of a sidebar. It makes me sad that Netflix doesn't do this anymore. But so this goes back like 10 years or so, when Netflix used to actually let you give a star rating to the movies that you watched. So you'd watch a movie, and then you'd be like, yeah, that was okay, like 3 stars. And this was actually like how they built recommendations for you was, and this was in the pre-streaming days more. So you would physically get your DVD, and then you'd rate it when you sent it back before you picked your next one. They actually got access to the authors of this paper got access to a database of people's ratings that Netflix released for some goofy like Netflix awards or something like that. But it's and still, I mean, it was a staggering amount of data, right? I mean, so this is a 3.6 million Netflix reviews, and then 750,000 restaurant reviews from Yelp, which that's still at least potentially there. So what they're finding, right? So it's kind of like the outcome variable essentially is people's ratings, and they can group people based on their ratings into whether they are monomixers, polypurists, polymixers. Of course, they're leaving the monopurists. They're leaving out on this table. They're kind of the reference group. But right. So the dependent is their ratings, and so where it's positive, you see that where you have an atypical film. So that's that second line in table 5, right? Where you have an atypical film or an atypical restaurant, the mono mixers are more likely to rate that positively, and the poly mixers similarly, right? If it's not, again, if it's the rom com that's a western, or remember, I'm sorry, this is probably a reference you won't understand, but do you remember Back to the Future Part 3? That was the one where they went out west, right? And so it's like a kind of sci-fi western sort of thing, right? Like that's like mixing up genres, right? The mixer like that stuff, but the key finding here is that there are people who are called polypurists, and in the univore omnivore literature, the polypurists show up as omnivores just in the same way that the polymixers show up as omnivores. But here, in table 5 is this evidence that the polypurists and the polymixers have really divergent opinions on some cultural objects. So that genre bending, or the fusion restaurant, the genre bending film, or the fusion restaurant are negatively rated by these purists, and that's really kind of the interesting finding here. Definitely hard to kind of suss out from all these statistics that they're throwing at you. But like you said, Jake, super significant finding. Of course, though, we have to be a little bit cautious about this stuff, because when you have 3 million data points, it's like any I mean, not literally any difference is going to be significant, but it's a lot easier to find significance in your findings there. Okay, so I just wanted to make sure we're on the same page with that. Then back to your discussion questions, if you could. Now that right, so yeah, social class and boundary spanning. And it's a good question, I guess. Can you guys suss out, or do you have an idea, like Jacob asks here, what do you think are the class standings of people who are polypurists, monopurists, polymixers, or monomixers? I mean, maybe there is there's a somewhat of a spoiler in the article, in as much as they don't know, right? They don't have. This is kind of, it's also makes it sort of a fun article. In as much as like we can say that these different kinds of people, but we know nothing about, like, they can make some informed judgments about Yelp reviewers because we know that like certain restaurants are more expensive than others. But with Netflix reviews, we know nothing about these people's demographic characteristics, their income, race, whatever. But who do you think is a what do you think a polypurist looks like, for example? Or not looks like, physically looks like, but like, what would be what would you assume is the profile of a person like that demographically?
Probably someone with more money, like a higher social class.
Yeah, didn't like on one of the pages they were talking about how like other studies have shown that like they're more likely to be of like higher social class or something like that. So like I feel like people that are polypurists are like they can afford to like take a little bit from like each culture or like genre and like especially when it comes to food. And they're like, I want it to be just this or just that. Mm.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, right? Um,
Yeah.
and then the other interesting thing there too would be to contrast that with who are the poly mixers, right? So if like if they're not like I want it to be just this way, who are the people who are like give me everything, right? Give me variety, give me all the genres, and I'll eat the weirdest food in the world. How are they different, do you think?
I feel like those kind of people are also like a higher class, though, because you have to be open to those kind of things, and you also like have to have the ability to do those things. So I would consider myself like a mixer though, but I'm also not rich, so I don't know.
And that also brings up a kind of a great point that's been a problem with all this literature going on. Is like, no, you're not rich, right? But you have high cultural capital, right? You're getting a liberal arts education, right? So there are these intersecting dimensions there. That's another kind of problem with this literature, and so just talking about this purely in terms of social class, like I've been, right, is not quite productive, right? And it's interesting, and I think Bourdieu would kind of agree with that. It's like, once you've gotten more education, once you're more open to other things, like even if you're poor, you're going to seek out like more interesting, more genre bending kinds of cultural products, right? Um, I always what this article makes me think of too is the like. Um, those like the hipsters who like they may listen to like different genres of music, but they'll tell you like, oh, that's not real, like, I don't know, deep house, that's not real punk music. Like they'll listen to punk and old fashioned country and this and that, but they'll tell you like, oh, you're not listening to like the right one. Right.
Mm-hmm. Gatekeepers.
Gate. Yes. Yes. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So that's good. And I just wanted what I'm not quite sure where you're going with the second discussion question, Jacob. So if you just real quickly like give us your thinking on that.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just trying to somehow connect cultural consumption with other articles that we talked about in the past, like Fine's article. on small groups. I'm not sure actually where I was going with that.
Yeah, no, it's good to kind of think on, for sure. And it's a little harder fine in particular. When he's looking at kids are weird about this kind of stuff. But the other kind of stuff that he's done, like mushroom hunters and stuff like that. I mean, it almost suggests that people try to enforce some purity in their cultural milieu. That was very good. It looks like that's all we've got for today. And so, like I said, the next article, actually, Lizardo and Skiles, is a bit more in the pure omnivore, univore tradition. So we'll a bit more on that on Wednesday. So thank you, guys. I guess, Mary, you want me to stick around for a second, and we can talk independent study. Otherwise, I'll see you guys on Wednesday.
Bye.